So your latest project is you were working on a book about capitalism.
That's right. That's right. I'm about 4 years into the project and maybe halfway through. No, I'm more than halfway through.
Do you have a title for the book?
I'm tentatively calling it Barren Metal. I got it from Shakespeare. If you remember the Merchant of Venice, there's a discussion at the beginning of the Merchant of Venice between Shylock and Antonio. And during this discussion, Shylock is talking about how he can make his money multiply faster than Laban's ewes and rams. And Antonio is kind of skeptical, and he refers to barren metal as a way of rebuking and repudiating what Shylock is saying. He's referring, of course, to Aristotle's statement that money is sterile. And the reason I think this is significant is that because from an economic point of view, I think there are only two options when it comes to value. And the one is human labor, which is the Christian option that got its first chance after the fall of the Roman Empire, when the Germanic tribes swept through Europe and the Benedictines tried to hold on to civilization. The motto of the Benedictines was ora et labora, which means to pray and to work. And Heinrich Pesch, who is a big influence on my life, has said that this was the first time that they had a culture that honored work, that saw work as the source of value, because the Roman Empire was, in many ways, held the belief that Shylock did. The Roman Empire was a slave economy that was heavily involved in usury. So the starting point of this book is going to be a distinction between these two approaches to the economy. And I'm saying that when the church is strong, usury is illegal, as it was during the time of the Holy Roman Empire. And when the Jews are strong, usury is the norm for the economy, and labor gets cheated and shortchanged. And I think that's the situation we're in right now.
So you talk about the history of usury. So I mean, usury goes way back thousands of years. So which religions? Obviously Christianity, but Islam too has prohibitions against usury. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think that in many ways, Islam was more successful in dealing with usury than Christianity was. And I think even the Pope, who is no friend of Islam as far as I can tell, even the Pope has admitted this. That Islam, one of the reasons for the success of Islam was that it simply abolished usury, would not tolerate usury. This is what the church should have done. This is what was on the books, but they never dealt with it. You had a period at the beginning of the money economy, just when the money economy was emerging from the feudal economy in Italy, let's say around the beginning of the 15th century. You had 100 years of preaching by the new orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, against usury, leading to the culmination of this campaign, which was in Florence, which was certainly one of the leading banking centers in Europe at that time. Savonarola, the Dominican, takes over Florence. The Medici are expelled. And here's a moment where the church could have taken control of the whole situation. Savonarola and a Franciscan by the name of Strozzi, one of the big banking families in Florence, created a Christian alternative to usury. It was called the Monte de Pietà. It was basically a pawn shop for poor people as an antidote to the Jewish pawn brokers who were charging 43 1/3% interest at that time. But unfortunately, Savonarola got caught up into church politics. He attacked the Pope, and the Pope counterattacked, and Savonarola was murdered, and the issue was never resolved. And to this day, it's pretty clear that the usury issue has not been resolved. All you have to do is look around you, look at Greece in the news today, and you realize the usury issue has not been resolved. Now, this doesn't mean that theoretically the church has ever repudiated its teaching. The church has not repudiated its teaching. The teaching of the church is still that taking interest on loans is sinful. This is in an encyclical called Vix Pervenit. You can type it into Google and you can read it yourself. That was issued in 1745, and that is the church's teaching. This is a solemn magisterial document issued by the Pope, which means that is the church's teaching. No Pope has ever contradicted this. This is the church's teaching. But obviously, if you look at this history, it was not implemented in the way that Islamic banking did implement that teaching.
And can you explain how Islamic banking works?
We have in Culture Wars, my colleague Dave Wemhoff has done a really deep and extensive look into Islamic banking, and I'd be happy to send anyone a copy of this. It's long and complicated, but if you write to culturewars.com, jones@culturewars.com, I'd be happy to send you a copy of this. But in a sense, what we're talking about, the CEO summary here is that fees are legitimate, but compound interest is not. So you can charge fees for banking services, but you cannot charge compound interest. Because
so it's the fee it's up front. It's not this on and on and on debt like we have today.
Right. Another article in Culture Wars magazine by one of our writers, Anthony Santelli, makes clear. He says $1 borrowed at the time of Christ at 5% interest. There aren't enough zeros in the world. I mean, this is an exaggeration. And if you go to, I can send you the Culture Wars article where we have the actual figure, but there aren't enough zeros in the universe to cover a figure this big. That is the intrinsic nature of compound interest, and that is why compound interest always destroys an economy. I don't think we need any more proof of this. It's all around us right now. Compound interest is going to destroy every economy on the face of the earth. So in terms of Greece, there was another bailout today for Greece. The bondholders had to take haircuts, 50%. The pension funds are going to pay. There's going to be suffering and misery among the Greek population. And because of compound interest, in 2 years, they're going to be back exactly where they are right now. It's simply something that does not work in the natural world. It is unnatural. There's no amount of wealth production in the world that can keep up with compound interest. That's why it always wrecks an economy.
And can you explain in more detail about how compound interest works?
It's a mathematical formula. I mean, basically, it's just that, the interest that you earn gets added to the principal and it builds in a geometric progression. Nothing grows in a geometric progression to keep fast enough to keep up with compound interest. The best example I can give you from the historical research I've done is from the chapter I've done on the Fugger family, which were the Catholic bankers who succeeded the Medici as the papal bankers. The Fugger family were the bankers for the Habsburgs, the family that was basically the premier family of the Roman emperors, the Holy Roman Empire. The Fugger family made their first loan to the Habsburgs in, I believe, 1494. Over the course of the next 70 years, the Habsburgs came into possession of all of the gold and silver mines in the New World. Now, this is an enormous amount of gold and silver at a time when gold and silver were money. That was the only source of money you had. If you wanted money, it had to be gold and silver. They had all of this, including all of the gold and silver that had already been mined and was used in ornaments, as ornament in places like Mexico by the Aztecs. All of this flowed into the coffers of the Habsburgs because Philip II, the Habsburg, was king of Spain, and he owned the New World. And yet, in spite of this, the Habsburg family went bankrupt in 1560. Now, this just shows you that if the Habsburgs, owning all the gold and silver, can't keep up with compound interest on the loan that they had to make to get elected Roman emperor, no force on earth, no productive capacity on earth can keep up with it. And so, therefore, we have to get rid of it, period. That's end of discussion.
Was compound interest, did someone invent it, or it just sort of gradually evolved?
Someone invented it, but no one knows who. It's so ancient that no one knows who did it. But I mean, it's well known in the ancient world, and it has the same effect everywhere. So if you're asking, what's the name of the guy? We don't know, but it's ancient and it's been around for as long as civilization.
So you say that, make the argument that usury is definitely the origins of capitalism. I mean, a lot of people say about capitalism is it has its origins, I guess, among sort of the Anglo-Protestants in the 18th century. You said something about that. It has actually, you said among Catholics that capitalism had its original origin. Is that correct?
First of all, my definition, the definition I'm working with, is that capitalism is state-sponsored usury. So usury has existed long before capitalism, if you want to define it in the modern sense of the word. Usury existed at the time, as I said, of the late medieval period, when the economy, the money economy, came into being in the city-states of northern Italy. So you could say what the Medici were doing in Italy as a result of the cloth industry, you could call that capitalism. There were lots of, like, double entry bookkeeping came into existence then, bills of exchange, bills of that type of thing. They came into existence, if you want to call that capitalism. But what I'm saying is that capitalism really came into existence when the state decided that it was going to become involved in enforcing what you would call usurious contracts. So there were Catholic kings and popes as well who would borrow money, but the trouble from the banker's point of view is that you didn't know whether they were going to pay you back because these contracts were illegal. And there was a long tradition in Italy of basically subterfuge, dry, I forget what it was called, dry exchange or something like that. But anyway, they were basically contracts that were usurious contracts based on compound interest, where you would disguise it as insurance payments and so on and so forth. So from the historical point of view, the crucial moment did come in England when the time of the Glorious Revolution, when basically it looked as if a Catholic James II were going to take the English throne, and the Whig oligarchs staged a revolution because they wanted to put the interest of capital over part of the law. In other words, the state was now going to enforce these usurious contracts. And so shortly thereafter, you had the founding of the Bank of England. And the Bank of England was basically virtually the same thing as our Federal Reserve System, a private bank that would lend money to the sovereign, which meant that a certain group of people, namely the Whigs, would profit from all the interest payments. And that, I suppose, if you're talking about modern capitalism and the English version of it, I think that's where you'd have to say it began.
Yeah, it's important to emphasize because your average person who's knows nothing of the topic, they'll just say that capitalism is simply the absence of government regulation in the economy, which it's obviously not the case, but that's what I think the majority of people would say if you ask them what their definition of capitalism is.
Yeah, I mean, generally when you say capitalism, people think, oh, you mean economic exchange. And so therefore, if you're against capitalism, well, then you must be against economic exchange. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Capitalism is a perversion of economic exchange. Capitalism is economic exchange skewed to the interest of a certain group of people. And that's sort of what has to be sort of teased out of this historical discussion. Because basically what you had was a revolution in England that commandeered the economy and said from now on the economy is going to serve the interest of a certain group of people to the detriment of everyone else. Now that is the antithesis of what an economy is. An economy means the entire group of people in a nation. The nation is the parameter under which the economy works. The goal of the economy is the good of everyone in the nation. Now, this is not socialism. Socialism is a reaction to capitalism. socialism is the pus that forms when the body politic becomes sick with capitalism. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an equitable, a distribution of goods where the exchange benefit is maximized for everyone. That doesn't mean everybody's going to earn the same amount of money, but it does mean that you're not going to allow a certain group of people, namely the usurers, to freeze up the entire economy because for their benefit, which is the situation we're in right now.
So you do go into Marxism, and what is your description of Marxism or socialism? So I know some people believe that Marxism was set up by the bankers. Do you believe that, or you believe it's just a reaction to capitalism?
It's a reaction to capitalism. It had to happen. Okay, if you begin with Adam Smith, let's take Adam Smith as the man who sort of codified the science of economics. I mean, before that, it was part of moral philosophy. He was a professor of moral philosophy. And that's
with Adam Smith, we'll go into the Marx, but just so he's considered the father of capitalism. Was he in favor of the state-sponsored usury?
He accepted it, yes. I mean, Adam Smith was a Whig. He was a Scotsman at the time of probably the biggest upheaval in Scotland, namely the Jacobite Rising of 1745. During the Jacobite Rising, Adam Smith was at Oxford, a student. He was unhappy. He felt that the Jacobites were in control of Oxford. He was not part of that party. He was part of the Whig Party. Okay, the Jacobites got their name from James II. That was the rightful king of England. He was deposed, and William of Orange was put in his place, and that was the beginning of the Whig oligarchic rule of England. That Whig oligarchic rule meant the promoting of the interest of the merchant class, and that's precisely who Adam Smith represented in Scotland. It was a battle in Scotland between the lowlands and the highlands, between the Presbyterians, who were the merchant class in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh, and the Highlands, which were still a feudal economy that was Catholic and loyal to the Stuarts. And that's why they were called Jacobites. So the Jacobite Rising of 1745 stuns everyone. They get within, Bonnie Prince Charlie shows up in Scotland. They raise an army overnight, and they march, and they get to within 100 miles of London. So they nearly conquered England. And everyone's shocked. And Adam Smith comes on the scene after that, after the Jacobite Rising, the brutal suppression of the Jacobite Rising after the Battle of Culloden in 1746. And he's there, in a sense, to represent the interest of the Whig oligarchs, because that's who he is. He said at one point to describe himself, he said, "My family kicked the Pope and the Pretender out of Scotland." The Pretender, of course, being Bonnie Prince Charlie at that particular moment. So this is a man who, in a sense, had many great insights. He created the modern science of economics. Much of what he says is true. He begins at the right point. Labor is the beginning of the wealth of nations. He understands that labor is the source of value. That's the only thing, except for the competing source, which is magic, which is alchemy, which is usury. Now, instead of sort of thinking this thing through to its logical conclusion, Adam Smith just says, well, these are my boys. I guess we just have to accept it. It's just part of life. And at that point, he defeats all of his insights into labor by accepting the legitimacy of usurious contracts.
So back to Marx, can you kind of explain how Marxism works and its response to capitalism and its position on usury and finance?
Well, it comes down to labor. I mean, basically, after Smith, he's got some insights, so it's something that needs to be clarified. In Smith's discussion of state debt at the end of The Wealth of Nations, he starts talking about the feudal era and useless mouths. The feudal lord would sustain useless eaters, useless mouths. Well, that's not my understanding of the the way the Holy Roman Empire valued labor. But that's his understanding. And what you see here is that there are going to be people who read this. So the first one guy who reads it is Malthus. Malthus reads it, and he goes off and starts talking about population. And then Ricardo reads it, and he starts saying that it's a zero-sum game. In other words, as soon as the wages of the worker go up, he procreates, has more children. As soon as he has more children, the effect of his money goes down, and there are more people competing for wages, and so the wages go down. So it's a zero-sum game. It always ends up in equilibrium. And Lassalle, the socialist from Germany, called this the iron law of wages. Now, if you believe this, there are two options. Either you kind of wring your hands the way Malthus and Ricardo do and say, gee, it's too bad, but that's the way life is, and you can't tamper with it because Newton said this is Newton and Smith said this is the order of the universe, and you can't tamper with that. Or you can accept it the way Marx did and say, yeah, that's the way it is, but it's an intolerable situation because look at the working class in misery and all these other people were rich, and so what we need is revolution. So they both begin with Smith, and they both head off in opposite directions, sort of taking Smith to different conclusions.
So was Marx was he against usury?
Well, he was against, he was more against capital. He saw capital as theft. It was the appropriation of surplus value, okay? The contractual appropriation of surplus value. And he came up with what is the labor theory of value. And in a sense, I believe in a labor theory of value because I'm saying the only source of value in this world is human labor. This is what Locke believed, this is what Adam Smith believed, and this is what Karl Marx believed, but they all believed it in different ways, and Karl Marx came up with what you would call an exaggeration of the value of labor, primarily, I think, because he was an atheist. And an atheist cannot understand the purpose of creation. Creation was made by God, and human wealth comes about by a collaboration between man and God through creation. And so what he had was a labor theory of value which said that all value comes from labor. Well, that's not true. You could say there is no value without labor. I think that is true. I think that Locke would agree with that. I think Smith would agree with that. But you can't say that all value is labor, comes from labor. Because you're leaving creation out of the picture. And so, for example, let's take a vineyard. Okay? There's a vineyard in a place like France that grows great wine with little effort. Okay, that's the value. It has great value, but there's relatively little human labor that goes into it. On the other hand, you could have a vineyard in, let's say, Iceland, in which case there's a huge amount of human labor that goes into it, and you end up with crappy wine or virtually nothing. This is the refutation of the labor theory of value, and I think it runs aground on Marx's atheism.
So you've also been discussing we've discussed the recent situation. I think it was Wisconsin and the concept of a right to work state. So what are your thoughts on labor unions and the situations? I think it was it also Ohio as well.
And Indiana now.
Indiana, that's correct.
Indiana just passed a right to work law, which is a disaster for the economy. Adam Smith says corporations are a conspiracy, okay? But this is a conspiracy that is promoted by this country because of its capitalist origins, its origins in Whig culture. In order to counter this conspiracy, you have to have a working man's conspiracy, if you want to use that term, or a union whereby the laborer can unite and withhold his labor to drive up the price. Because if you don't, the wages will be driven down and down and down and down, and you will end up defeating the economy, which is precisely what happened in Florence in the course of the 14th and 15th century. They had a booming textile industry. This is where the wealth came from. The wealth came from skilled workers being able to produce high quality wool, dyed wool that was in demand all over Europe. Their cloth was in demand all over Europe. What they did though, because this was the beginning of the capitalist impulse, they appropriated all of the surplus value and left the working man basically a subsistence wage, and then it went below a subsistence wage. And how do we know this? How do we know this was below a subsistence wage? Because the working class population over the 50 years of the biggest prosperity in Florence, the population went down. It dropped because the worker could not sustain a family. That is the ultimate criterion of a just society, of an equitable and successful society. The working man must be able to maintain a family with his wage, which means he must earn something like double or triple what you would call a subsistence wage. Well, I'm saying that I mentioned that in Florence, after this wealth was created, the Florentine oligarchs, people like the Medici family, took all of the surplus value out of the economy and took it away from the worker to the point where the worker could not reproduce. He could not have families. The population went down. And as a result, they destroyed the goose that laid the golden egg, namely the textile industry that was the source of all wealth in Florence. Surplus labor, by surplus labor, I mean when you have a pound of flour, it has a certain value. If you apply human labor to it, you can create X amount of bread, which has a much higher value than a pound of flour, because it's much easier to use. You can eat the bread right there, then and there. And so therefore, what you've created is value. And when you create, this is called surplus value. And what you do at this point is the big question for any economy or any culture is, how do you divide up that surplus labor? Now, I am not going to deny that capital has certain rights because they provided the wherewithal. That's not the issue in our economy. The issue in our economy and our culture is, does a worker have any rights? And that's always been the issue here. For some reason, this country thinks that it can get by without labor. I don't know where they get this idea, but this is what's behind all these right to work laws, that you can simply drive down wages and somehow the country will prosper. You can't drive down wages and have a country prosper because you're killing the economy. And that's precisely what all of these right to work laws.
So what's the definition of right to work?
No union shop, no closed shop. At least that's the way it's been defined in Indiana, which means you're weakening the ability of the laborer to bargain with the owners of capital.
What's your opinion on public employee unions?
They get trotted out as a way of discrediting unions in general. This is what happened in Wisconsin. What we need to do is look at the big picture here. Why are we in economic trouble? Is it because of high wages? No, it is not because of high wages. It is because of usury. That is the source of our problem right now. It is because of government debt tied to compound interest, which always, even Adam Smith said this, always spirals out of control and always enfeebles every economy where it takes place. Whenever this happens, the people who control the culture in a capitalist society invariably turn and decide to loot labor as their way out of the problem. And this invariably makes the situation worse, because in cutting wages, you're cutting the economy, the size of the economy, and the economy then enters into a death spiral, which is precisely what happened after the stock market crash of 1929. The powers that be decided to drive down wages. They drove down wages by 50%, 55% in this time, and they sent the country into the Great Depression. It happens over and over and over again because the country is controlled not by the working man, it's controlled by bondholders and their interests. So they want full return on their usurious contracts, and the only place they can get it is by appropriating, looting pension funds, driving down wages, and even more recently, we have to cut Social Security. And they try and disguise this by calling Social Security an entitlement, which is not what it is.
So would you say the big part of the destroying the labor and wages is the free trade and open mass immigration issue?
Well, mass immigration guarantees cheap labor. That's the whole purpose. That's why the government will never clamp down on immigration, because they want cheap labor. All of these rich people want Guatemalan maids and people from Mexico to mow their lawns, and it drives wages down. That's why it's in their interest. So that's how that fits in with the whole cheap labor issue.
And in your book, do you also get into how the Federal Reserve was set up?
I'm going to. As I said, I'm halfway through. I'm in the middle of talking about Adam Smith right now. So the articles that have appeared in Culture Wars so far, one chapter on the Ciampi Rebellion about Florence. In January 2012 issue, I have a chapter on Sir Isaac Newton and the metaphysics of capitalism. And now, in the next month, in the April issue, we're going to have a chapter on John Law and paper money. And then after that, it will be Adam Smith. So that's sort of where I am right now.
So it's in historical order.
That's right. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, because I think you can only understand economics as it came into existence. The worst thing that ever happened to economics was people thinking that it was a kind of physics, pseudo-physics. It is not. It's not physics. It's philosophy. It's moral philosophy, because the heart of economics is two people getting together and agreeing to make an exchange. That has nothing to do with physics whatsoever. Okay? That has to do with the human will choosing the good, and so therefore it should be part of practical reason and moral philosophy, which is where it was originally.
What is your thoughts? I mean, you talk about some economic alternatives, but what is your thought on social credit?
Well, the trouble is you're flying in the face of what money is. And in order to understand what money is, you have to start with how it came into existence as a replacement for barter. So economic exchange began basically with people from two different areas where the surplus was different. And they would come together, and sometimes you see this with primitive tribes. The beginning of economic exchange was basically leaving whatever you had a lot of in a clearing. And then the other tribe would come and they'd see it, and if they liked it, they'd leave what they had a lot of, and you would make an exchange. And it was called blind barter, because this avoided the possibility of hostility, an attack if you got into an argument about haggling over the price of it. Now, Aristotle says this is obviously unwieldy, because if you have a cow and you want eggs or a coat, it's clear that a cow is worth a lot more than a coat. So how do you divide up the cow? You can't divide up the cow. So what you want to do is find something that everyone values, everyone would want, and over the course of time, this came down to be basically gold and silver. So there was a real concentration of wealth in gold and silver that everybody recognized as valuable, and that's the beginning of money. And at that point, there was no leap of faith here. As soon as there was a little bit of element of insecurity, because you couldn't tell whether that was really gold or whether there was a mixture of an alloy, and you couldn't tell whether you had to weigh it and assay it. And so what happened is that you would have the coin replacing simply a lump of gold, because the coin would say basically the state here has certified that this is gold of a certain weight and fineness, and you can trust it, and so therefore you can facilitate exchange.
So
now,
is that the gold standard?
That was the basis of the gold standard. So why should I give you something if I'm not sure that what you're giving me has any value? If I see that you've got gold there, I'm reassured, and so you can have it because I understand that gold has value. Now, this is going to strangle the economy at a certain point because there's not enough gold around to grow with the economy. And that became clear during the 15th century. The term is the great bullion dearth of the 15th century. So how do you get beyond that? Well, banks started to take in your gold, and what they would do is they'd give you a receipt for your gold. And if we had trust in the bank, if it proved itself, which is what happened in 1607 with the Wisselbank in Amsterdam, everybody believed in the probity and trust, had confidence in the bank, and so therefore this paper took on the same value quality that the gold had. And that's the beginning of the gold standard. And now you could issue money, much more money than you had in gold, because not everybody's going to use the gold at the same time. The Italians discovered this during the Crusades, when the knights would leave their gold with them and they would start lending it out. And they lent out more than they had. And it was fine as long as nobody found out about it, because everybody showed up and lost confidence. They'd show up at your bank and you had to run on the bank and the whole thing went bust. So basically, you could improve the economy to the extent that you had trust. Now, trust is based on prudence, and prudence is a moral virtue. So you could expand the economy to the extent that you were moral. But at the very point that they're doing this, which is to say the 17th century, the 18th century, the Bank of England, 1694, and so on and so forth, you've got a philosophy that is being articulated by people like Adam Smith, where you don't need morals. He's a professor of moral philosophy who doesn't believe in moral reasoning. He believes in instincts, and if everyone follows their self-interest, that's governed by competition, you have a Newtonian system that gives you perfect motion and you don't need morals. And so you see the problem is going to arise because you have this sophisticated possibility, but it's all based on prudence, which is now in short supply. So that leads to the whole downfall of these paper systems.
I'd like to discuss for the rest of the show, get into your book about urban renewal. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the issue of capitalism before we move on?
No, you can. The urban renewal has the advantage of you can actually buy the book. I actually finished. That's done. The Slaughter of Cities. I wrote that a couple of years ago, and we have copies available at culturewars.com if you want to buy it. But go ahead.
Okay, well, so what's the premise? The premise of the book, The Slaughter of Cities, talk about the premise of it.
Well, the premise was derived from my experience of growing up in Philadelphia. There's actually, I have an example that just came across the internet. A picture of Hiroshima in 1945, a picture of Hiroshima in 2010, a picture of Detroit in 1945, a picture of Detroit in 2010. And what you see is the exact opposite. Hiroshima is in ruins. The atomic bomb has gone off there. Now it's a booming, beautiful town. Detroit was a booming, beautiful town in 45, and now it's in ruins. So the implication is clear. Something more destructive than the atomic bomb got set off in Detroit, and nobody knows what it is. Now, I grew up in Philadelphia, and I saw the same thing. Basically, how is it possible that these cities could end up being destroyed in this way? Did it just happen? And I knew it just didn't happen because I'd lived in Europe for years. And in Europe, there was all sorts of destruction after World War II, and now the cities look better than they did 30 years ago. So the farther they get, the better, the older they get, the better they get. So why is this happening? And that's what led me to start doing research into the people who destroyed the cities. Urban renewal, what was the purpose of that? And then you go deeper and deeper and into all of these government schemes. And the bottom line, which led me to my thesis, was that it was basically a way to destroy Catholic ethnic neighborhoods, because Catholic ethnic neighborhoods after World War II were perceived as too politically powerful by the people who ruled this culture.
So you say something interesting. You say it was a coalition of the Jews and the WASPs. A lot of people sort of assume that those two groups were rivals at the time.
No, not in Philadelphia, certainly. They were members of the same organization called the ADA, Americans for Democratic Action. And they were the Enlightenment progressives. They were, I guess we call them liberals now. But, no, they both, what they had in common was their hatred of the Catholics. And so they formed this alliance. And, the earlier you go back, the more WASP it was, I have to say, because the Jewish influence, came to bear later, the more you get toward the 70s, for example. But, it was a WASP Jewish alliance, certainly in Philadelphia.
But it's interesting. I mean, on a side note, I know Charles Lindbergh, I think he was of Swedish descent, but he said it was a coalition of those two groups that lobbied to get us into World War II. So that's interesting how I guess because a lot of people kind of assume that there was a rivalry between those two groups. Maybe there was earlier, but I
don't think there ever was. I mean, Karl Marx says that Puritans were demi-Jews. Puritanism was a Jewish take on Christianity. They were Christians who wanted to act like Jews.
So Christian Zionism has its roots from the Puritans, actually. Well, I thought a lot of people say it from the Schofield Bible, which was
that
later.
was certainly influential. There's no question about it. But the roots do go back to Puritanism or to Calvinism, because these are Christians who were sick of the Catholic prescriptions on society. I mean, I deal with this in my book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, which begins the revolution breaks out with the Hussite rebellion in Bohemia at the beginning of the 15th century. These were monks who hated living like monks and decided, well, what's the alternative? And they turned to the Old Testament, and they suddenly became Old Testament prophets because, hey, those guys were allowed to have more than one wife and, blah, 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 the whole thing. So it's there from the beginning. There's this Judaizing strain in Christianity that has always been a part of what Protestantism is, the heart of Protestantism.
But wasn't Martin Luther was fairly anti-Jewish?
Right. He was not part of what I'm talking about here.
So this came out of England mostly.
Yeah, we're talking primarily about the Puritans in England, where it reached its full flowering. The Hussites were certainly Judaizers. There's no question about it. But, I mean, they were sort of localized and never really got out of Bohemia. But when the Calvinists in Holland linked up with the English, the looters of the Catholic Church in England, that was a powerful coalition. And I think that's the beginning of capitalism. And it also shows that capitalism always begins with theft. It certainly was the case in England, that capitalism began with the theft of church property.
So on the urban renewal thing, what were the main reasons they felt they were threatened by the Catholics in those cities?
Well, you need to go back to a figure like Paul Blanchard, who wrote a book called American Freedom and Catholic Power. It's hard to believe now, but right after World War II, Blanchard was saying, now that we defeated fascism, the main heirs of fascism now are the Catholics. It's just a historical moment. There's no way to get around it. And virtually the entire WASP ruling class thought that Blanchard was onto something. And what you saw was these people acting out these impulses that Blanchard had created through things like urban renewal. Places like Boston, the North End, all these Italians, they needed to be Americanized. The Blanchard brothers, when they were young men, worked in a Polish parish in Philadelphia. They were students of John Dewey. And they were interested in Americanization, and they realized they were also behaviorists. John B. Watson was big at this point. And they believed that basically if you change the environment, you can change the person. So obviously they put two and two together. Let's change the environment. These ethnic enclaves, especially the Polish neighborhoods, are full of people who will never become Americans if we leave them to their own devices. So we'll simply break up their neighborhoods.
Did they use the blacks as kind of their tools?
That's right. So what happened is a guy like Louis Wirth was a Jew who was working at the University of Chicago, which is created by the Rockefellers. So here's the WASP Jewish Alliance again. America enters World War II. There's a huge labor shortage. The only source of labor now are Negro sharecroppers in the South and women. And so what they need to do is bring those black people up to the North and get them working in factories. So that's easy enough. You have railroads that will do that. But where are you going to put them? And this is where the crucial, like Detroit, becomes crucial. 250,000 black people show up in Detroit in a 9-month period of time. Where are you going to put them? Well, they decided we're going to stick them in Polish neighborhoods, because what we're going to do here is kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We're going to create housing for the workers, for the arsenal for democracy in Detroit, and we're also going to break up these ethnic enclaves because they're not American. You can't trust these Polacks. They talk in languages that we can't understand. They all support unions. They're Catholic. It's just got all these strikes against them. So we're going to move the blacks in, and they will become the avant-garde of revolutionary ferment in Catholic neighborhoods. Took place in every big city in the North.
So what was their view on the blacks? I mean, did they have they personally probably had a look down on blacks, but they just saw them as convenient tools.
I think they were. I mean, the Jews especially, beginning with the NAACP, which is a totally Jewish organization, they tried to use the blacks as the avant-garde of their revolutionary movement for about 60 years, from, let's say, 1909, the founding of the NAACP, up to 1967, when the wheels came off, when Harold Cruz wrote his book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, and said, basically, look, they've used us. He was a communist. He was a communist in Harlem. The Communist Party used the blacks for Jewish ends. That's the whole gist of that book. And when that became widespread, the whole thing fell apart. So that was that. The WASP was part of the same thing. After my book came out, The Slaughter of Cities, a guy I know who was a WASP became a Catholic, but in one of the big law firms in Philadelphia, said the head of the law firm came to him and said, we made Wilson Good the first black mayor of Philadelphia. We meaning the WASP ruling class, we anointed him because we didn't want the city to fall into the hands of the Catholics. That's the whole story of Slaughter of Cities in a nutshell. And the Negro sharecropper from places like Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, they were the tools. They were used to destroy these neighborhoods, and now that they're destroyed, the WASP ruling class has created a Frankenstein. Philadelphia, to give an example, has invested billions of dollars in infrastructure in the center of the city, and they can't get people to move there because of black crime. That's their Frankenstein. They created it, and now they don't know how to deal with it.
And I guess they've done the same thing with immigrant groups as well. Have you studied the Immigration Act of 1965?
Sure. The Jews were Jacob Javits. The Jews wanted this because it watered down what they perceived as a threat. The white majority, the Northern European majority. Yeah. And it also, the industrialists went along because, well, it's cheap labor, you know, and so we have now a disorganized, instead of having these great, like Italian neighborhoods that are.
But the original one from the original Immigration Act in the 1920s, that one favored Northwestern Europeans, so it did keep out a lot of the Italian and Eastern European Catholics as well.
Yeah, that one was Madison Grant. He was the author of that, and that was anti-Catholic. That was anti-Catholic in its orientation. Just as the Klan in the second Klan, the Klan of the 1920s, was more an anti-Catholic organization than the first Klan.
And I think the first Klan they weren't necessarily anti-Jewish, because I think the Confederacy had a Jewish attorney general.
The anti-Jewish feeling did not arise until the Leo Frank trial. And I cover that in my book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. The Jews were considered a benevolent group at that point, or ignored. But the Leo Frank trial changed that completely.
So we're out of time. I'd like to thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me.